Hello there, listeners. Ben Orchard here. Welcome to Swords, Sorcery and Synthesizers. If you're new to the show, what normally happens is that I discuss some beloved 80s fantasy movie with my friend, the award-winning author Claire Fitzpatrick, and we try to figure out what lies behind the nostalgia. But Claire's on holiday, so this week I invited Ky Garvey, host of the Totally Lit podcast, to come on the show. If you haven't heard it already and you're at all interested in books, then you should definitely give Totally Lit a listen. There are many profound, deeply thought-provoking interviews with a wide variety of different writers there. Anyway, today Ky and I will be discussing that action-adventure classic, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
I'm just forcing my voice and opinions out on the world, and it probably were a little bit. I am a bit serious when I'm interviewing other authors, but
okay.
So we But I think some things translate through the ages, like in the classics. But I do have a passionate love of all the Indiana Jones franchise. So for me, I'm like, oh, this is my jam. I can talk to you about this.
All right. Well, how about we start by talking about our sort of trajectory as Indiana Jones fans and what the appeal is of the character and the mythology. And, I can start things off if you like, and then you can tell me what your perspective on this, I don't know what you'd call it, a franchise, a mythology, what it is. I was born in 1982. Too young to have seen the movies in the cinema, obviously. So my first introduction to the Indiana Jones character was actually like the 1992-1993 TV series, The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which I know is a very divisive piece of work amongst fans, of sort of a love it or hate it kind of thing. I love it. But it probably helped the fact that I was introduced to that first as a 10-year-old. And it was something that I wasn't comparing it to the movies because the TV series was very much grounded in historical reality. Each of the episodes featured Indiana Jones meeting some famous historical figure, and it was sort of edutainment in a way. But it's large part of why I'm such a big history buff today. And I ended up following that. There was a whole bunch of spin-off novels featuring young Indiana Jones, most of them written by a guy called Les Martin. And there was a video game called Fate of Atlantis as well that came out. And so I consumed all this spin-off media before I actually got to the original trilogy, and I watched them all in the wrong order. I was growing up in this small country town where we had a very small video store, and the only one of the Indiana Jones movies they had was Temple of Doom. So that was the first one I watched.
Which one?
And that was the one with the thuggy cult and the worship of Kali and the guy tearing out someone's heart from their chest while it's still beating and all this other really twisted, violent, supernatural stuff that obviously wasn't in the TV series. I was 12 at the time, and my parents thought I was ready for it, but the thing is, Last Crusade was the very next movie I saw after Temple of Doom. I was sort of, as a kid, I was at the mercy of the TV stations, what they'd put on TV. So I experienced the next couple of movies, like I watched Temple of Doom first because that was the only one they had at the local video store. Then I had to wait around till one of the TV stations wanted to rerun them. The other movies. So I saw Last Crusade and then Raiders of the Lost Ark. I saw the first one of the original trilogy last. I think I envy so much my niece and nephew growing up with streaming services where they can just, pick an old, like they want to revisit an old movie or an old TV show, they can just pick it and watch it.
Yeah.
That wasn't a reality when I was growing up. So I really loved Indiana Jones, the bits that I'd seen, and I was just like, had my fingers crossed. I hope the TV station plays the next one.
Come on. I'm waiting for the next one. I feel like The Last Crusade was a little bit tamer compared to Temple of Doom in that it was more family friendly.
Oh, sure. And it's sort of about families and father, son.
And I was picking up, just watching it again last night, on that relationship between father and son as well. And even just thinking about how Indiana is wanting to impress. He wants his father to be proud of him, and he's lived in his shadow. And I was like, oh, that's the way I sometimes have felt with my dad when he's been very focused on something he's concentrating on and has made me feel a little bit like I'm in the way or got, be quiet, I'm doing this. And I'm like, oh, I remember feeling that way too. But I didn't feel that when I was young watching that movie, but I did feel it now watching.
Did your dad sort of consider his career as something of a vocation?
Not even a career per se, but if he's watching the news, you can't interrupt the news. And if he does a lot of, he is a big cricket and AFL fan, and he used to do a lot of work where he would put in the statistics into spreadsheets and things like that. And I'm not quite sure. I think he may have been thinking about producing a book from it all. But he was very focused on that. And so sometimes you would feel, hey, Dad, I'm a kid, I exist. And he'd go, I'm doing my statistics right now. And yeah, I could see, like in the start of The Last Crusade, where Indiana Jones is just got the cross from the bad guys with Dad, and he's just trying to show his dad and get some attention. But Dad is very focused on what he's passionate about, just sort of waving him away and engrossed in his life's work, but also just missing what's going on right in front of his face, So I found that interesting to watch as an adult and as a parent, actually.
With The Last Crusade and the father-son relationships that you said, I think it makes such a difference watching the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles first, because you see how the Jones family are actually quite close when Indy's a child, when he's 10 or something. And that is because he had a younger sister who died in infancy. And Dad brought the surviving family members closer together. And then what happened is his mum dies of some unspecified illness when he's 12 or something.
She's very rarely mentioned in the movies.
Well, that's the thing. You get to see her and get to know her in the TV series, and then you get to see the process of estrangement as Henry Jones Sr. becomes more withdrawn in his grief. And what happens is that World War I breaks out, and Indy develops as quite a angry young man, sort of troubled adolescent, and decides to enlist in the Belgian army under a false name in World War I. And fight in World War I, and he's estranged from his father for 3 years while he's off in the trenches. And
is that on a streaming service now? Is there anywhere I can find it?
I don't know. I think Disney's bought up.
I want to watch it.
Disney's bought up all the Lucasfilm rights, so maybe it's on there. I don't know.
We did have a joke last night because I said, "Oh, now this is part of Disney. Does that make Elsa a Disney princess?" And then, because I'm going to do a spoiler, my husband was going, "Let it go, Elsa, let it go." So you what the end? Yes. So we actually, excuse me, really enjoyed watching it together and just having a bit of a laugh and a bit of banter. And also, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Saturday Night Live sketches where Sean Connery is a contestant on Jeopardy, and he's always going, "I'll take anal bum cover for 7,000 Trebek." because it's meant to be album cover and he sort of has misread it. So my husband was also at the end of every sentence that Henry Jones said last night, Sean Connery, of course, he was adding Trebek at the end. And so we were then rolling around the floor thinking we were hilarious. But it's interesting how when you watch a movie by yourself, it's very, very a quiet experience. But as soon as you have people with you, like there's all that banter and conversation that happens in a different experience as well. Although he was getting I was yelling at the TV quite a lot, just going, "Look out, Indy, you can do it, Indy." He's like, "It's a movie, calm down." But for me, I was about 10 or 11 when it came out at the cinemas, and I saw it 4 times somehow. I don't know how, as I didn't have my own income.
Just the force of pairs to power of getting your parents. Please, let me just see.
Mum and Dad definitely took me to see it, but I think potentially my girl guides group went to see it, and then my friend invited me to go, and there was just a series of everybody wanted to go see it, and I just kept getting invited. And like from the moment I saw it, I was in love with it, and then had the joy of seeing it repeatedly. And it kind of embedded in my DNA a little bit. But to sort of explain that, it sort of got me very interested in Grail lore. And when I went to university, I did some subjects in archaeology and anthropology, and have always been then interested in Arthurian legend. And so one movie that is just part of pop culture has actually like informed a lot of my life and what I am interested in and continue to be interested in as an adult, just from watching one Steven Spielberg film, you know.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, actually, on several different levels. I mean, first of all, I like the fact that you went to see it as part of like a Girl Guides group. It was like young Indiana is the Boy Scout in there, flashback sequences at the start of the movie. But also just, yeah, the idea of like fictional characters and their adventures inspiring you to like want to, research and, dive deeper into certain subjects. I can relate to that. That's what I was trying to say about the young Indiana Jones Chronicles and how like each episode saw him meet a different historical figure, and that inspired me to be a history buff. I never formally studied archaeology or anthropology.
I think we mastered the first subject. They got us to map out the quad, like you were doing an archaeological dig where you have to do all the string and peg everything together, and that broke me. I'm like, I'm going to be in research. I'm not going to be out in the field at a dig. So I realized very quickly that I was not ever going to be an actual archaeologist after doing my first subject part.
Well, yes, real world archaeology and anthropology, there's a lot of like painstaking minutiae and actual sort of, hard work and digging. Not as adventurous as in these movies. That's for sure.
I don't know. Have you been Time Team?
The Tony Robinson.
Yes, and like the actual real archaeologists are not Harrison Ford running all over the planet. They're actually very different in real life.
For sure. Just finishing up on what I was going to say about my initial perceptions of the movie. I was going to say that watching the young Indiana Jones Chronicles first made The Last Crusade seem like the conclusion of a like long ongoing character arc in terms of the father-son relationship. That sort of foreshadowing enhanced my enjoyment of the movie enormously. With regards to like the appeal of the character and the mythology in a more general sense, I think you touched upon it. I feel that when I was watching this as a youngster, first as a tween and then as a teen, Indiana Jones was something of a vicarious wish fulfillment character, in the sense that, I was a geek, I was a history buff, I was someone who was fascinated by ancient cultures. I never found like history classes boring at all. I love like hearing my teachers talk about different societies and how people lived with like a totally different sense of mental priorities and the way they went about their day-to-day lives in different times in ancient cultures. That was fascinating to me. So to have this character who had these sort of, I don't know, geek elements to him, like he was cultured, he was a historian, he was an academic, but he was also an action adventure hero. He was also, ruggedly handsome. He also, slept with all these beautiful women. I mean, I discovered this like when I was on the cusp of like being a hormone crazed teenager after all. So that appealed to me. And also because I was growing up in this small country town and like feeling my horizons were very limited, and like he was having all these globe-trotting adventures. Like, I think part of why I became a film buff is to sort of like fill the void that, I've never been able to afford to travel as much as I'd like.
No, you can. I've had this New Zealand.
So yes, these sort of globe-trotting adventures and him having these adventures like as a child and as a teenager and as an adult was sort of appealing to me. And I guess what I liked about the mythology was the idea that like all myths are true. The fact that it blends not only details of like real world historical events with Judeo-Christian mythology, Hindu mythology, like in some of the spin-off media stuff like, Fate of Atlantis, Greco-Roman mythology. I was just like, it's such a rich tapestry.
It is, and when you're watching these movies as a child and seeing those places and understanding that they're real places you can go, maybe going back to Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm also very interested in Egyptology, so then I was like, I want to go there. And then when I was watching The Last Crusade, even last night, like, oh, Venice, I want to go to Venice, and I want to be everywhere that Indiana Jones has been. And I said to my husband, because he was teasing me a bit about, oh, Indy, you love Indy. I'm like, no, I'm not in love with Indiana Jones. I want to be Indiana Jones. There's a difference. And that true up for me is like that adventure and uncovering, solving puzzles and uncovering mysteries that no one else has been able to figure out. Like, that's so exciting to me. And just even when you meet the knight that has had been protecting the Grail all those years, to me, one thing that strikes me is that he was there doing his job very happily in that cave for 2,000 years or so. And he was like, I knew you would come. And like just having like that idea of faith as well, or like, oh, he's been trapped in a cave for 2,000 years, but he's not even annoyed. He's like, here you are. I knew you were coming eventually. And that idea that people have such a passion about what they believe in. And even the guys that you think are the bad guys, I can't remember what religion they are now, but they're protectors of the Grail as well, and they're in the speedboat and all that. And he says to Indy, my soul is prepared, is yours. Like so much faith in protecting something they believe in. That also excited me as well. It's like, oh, what would I do in that situation? Would I be prepared to die for something I believe in? Possibly not. But yeah, just so many exciting themes that are raised in the films that you could go off on so many tangents about as well. That as a young person, just thinking about what possibilities there are in the world as well.
Well, if people asked me, like, what do you believe in? I would probably say that I'm an agnostic who leans towards atheism. I've struggled very much with, like, understanding faith, and I have a lot of serious objections to organized religion. But the thing is, yes, I envy like people who have that sense of certainty about how the universe works. And I think perhaps that's, I didn't really think about it until you just mentioned it. But I think maybe that's another appeal of this series of movies, is that it's set in a universe where like all these fantastical and mystical elements are manifest like plainly and in a tangible way, alongside just the mundane details of everyday life and all of the sort of established sort of historical events.
But even the book burning scenes, when you don't know that that's what happened during that period of time, to be seeing that and going, oh, people did do that. And like in those scenes where Elsa is crying because it actually hurts her to see those books being burnt because she's passionate about her studies and values those books. But then the conflict between, oh, I'm also a Nazi. Oh. So it's interesting. There's so many things raised in the films that as a child you wouldn't even, you kind of accept that those things are happening. But as an adult, if you watch them where you've got more of an informed view of life, it's like, oh, okay, there's so many conflicts here in a lot of the film.
Well, you mention Elsa, and if I was like to give a reason why The Last Crusade is my favorite of the Indiana Jones films, she's a large part of that. And I think a lot of that has to do with the like moral ambiguity of her character. I mean, you say that she's not a Nazi, but at one point she says, I believe in the Grail and not the swastika.
Yes.
And I get the impression that she's more of an opportunist who is sort of allying herself to whichever like superpower, whichever like group had the biggest resources that will like get her to the goal that she wants. Which
she's willing to manipulate the Joneses against each other.
Well, yes, and sleep with both of them. But
like last night, I was like, "Ooh, yeah."
But seriously, I was going to say that whenever I watch this movie, I'm amazed that Alison Doody didn't become a superstar after this. I mean,
not just because stunning her looks as well as her acting.
Well, not just because she's very beautiful, but it's quite a nuanced performance. Anyway, I think the thing about Elsa is that she's someone who, wants to think that the ends justify the means. But obviously a part of her is still struggling with that.
And that concept of that it belongs in a museum that resonated all through that film. And my husband did comment at the end, Indiana Jones, you belong in a museum. I'm like, now steady on. Don't insult him. But that concept of she sees that glittery prize at the end of the Grail and risks her life to have it, and then loses it because of that. It is does raise what will you do for the thing that you want as well? How far will you go?
Well,
I did want to ask you, what did you feel about the difference between the character in the Chronicles and the young Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade? Were you happy with that character? Did you think River Phoenix was the same as the Chronicles?
Well, the thing is that River Phoenix at the start of the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, it's a very small appearance, and he doesn't really get to like delve too deeply into like the emotional torment of the character or whatever, because it's like he's caught up in all his action sequences, and it's a very sort of fleeting flashback sequence. I mean, Sean Patrick Flannery had like 2 seasons of a TV series and a few TV movies to sort of develop the character. He had a lot more to work with. In a way, I don't think it's really fair to compare the two.
I did think that he got the like that glowering scowl right in terms of being young Indy. But yeah, I do agree that there was just like a lot of running around and not actual acting. There was more just being involved in the chase, and the real part you see is when he's with his father trying to get his attention. But yeah, a lot of it is just running through the train, and I love that sequence though with the
The
train with all the animals, and he gets into the magic car and then disappears through the bottom, and some of that, and especially the music that they use, like it keeps you engaged and excited right from the start as well, so that you're really expecting action through the whole film.
In one of the previous episodes that I recorded with Claire, we were talking about film scores and how a lot of modern film scores, like, I don't know, say Hans Zimmer's score for the recent Dune movies, are more textural than melodic, whereas a lot of the more traditional film scores, like John Williams' scores for the Indiana Jones movies, have various different sort of motifs that are associated with different characters and are repeated in variations throughout the film. And they're very sort of melodic, even if you listen to them as something separate from the film. And that is certainly true for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I mean, everyone knows the main sort of like march theme for Indiana Jones. Dun, 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 dun. But there's some other sort of very sprightly, like very memorable themes in here that are like original for this movie. There's one piece called Scherzo for Motorcycle and Orchestra, which is for the like motorcycle and sidecar chase sequence. I mean, that's quite a sprightly tune, quite a memorable piece. And the main Grail theme, the motif that recurs throughout the movie whenever they get one step closer in the quest. And it also doubles as like I guess you could say the love theme for the father and son relationship. That's also pulls at the heartstrings, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So do you have a favorite part of the movie? What is your favorite?
The whole extended tank chase sequence that, you know, it encompasses so many things. Like there's shootouts, there's like horse riding, horse stunts, there's, you know, fisticuffs, you know.
And just constantly punctuated with a little bit of humor, like something funny happens as well. Like it'll all be very tense, and then and even like when Indy goes over the cliff and everybody's like, oh, he's dead. Oh, I didn't say all the things I needed to say. And they're all looking down and he's on the other side of them climbing up, and he's kind of walked up behind them sort of going, what's going on? What are you looking at? And then they're all like, oh, we didn't even see you. Are you alive? Just those constant, I guess, points of stress and tension, and then they're broken up with a bit of humor. That happens the whole way through the movie as well.
I'm thinking of the scene where Indy is posing as like a Nazi ticket inspector on the airship, and then it throws out one of the Nazi goons, and then says, looks at all the passengers look shocked at him, and he's like, no ticket, and then they're like,
they're all waving, we've got our ticket. Yes, those sort of things happen quite frequently in the film. Yeah, so I was enjoying the humor as well. Although the character of Marcus Brody, in The Last Crusade, he's sort of portrayed as a bit of a bumbling kind of guy. But then, because we were watching it on Paramount, the streaming service, and it took us straight into Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he was much more serious.
Oh, great. So you watched it in the exact same order that I did as a child, like Last Crusade, then Raiders.
Yeah, so, but seeing, you could really see the difference in the way his character was portrayed in the different films. And he was much more serious and academic. And then in Last Crusade, then he's kind of the bumbling friend who's always got lost in his own museum, did you say, kind of thing. And at the end, he's like, follow me, I know the way. Which my friend and I, as 11-year-olds, that was like one of our favorite sayings together. Follow me, I know the way. But yeah, I found that interesting as well, that some of the characters are not exactly the same in each film as they are in the others.
Well, they had different screenwriters. I think that the original screenwriter on Raiders of the Lost Ark was Lawrence Kasdan, who, as a writer-director, is better known for more introspective, uh, character-focused indie films like The Big Chill and The Accidental Tourist. Whereas the screenwriter for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Jeffrey Boehm, we actually covered one of his other films, The Lost Boys, on an earlier episode of the podcast. He also did the screenplays for the Lethal Weapon films, a couple of the Lethal Weapon films, and The Phantom, as in like the purple suited.
Oh yes, Billy Zane,
Phantom superhero. Yes, they had a sort of jocular vibe to them, but they had a darker edge to them too. I think that's probably reflected in his screenplay of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade as well.
Yeah, so I thoroughly enjoyed rewatching it and reliving all my favorite bits. I think my favorite part is that sequence where Indiana Jones has to go through all of those steps to get to the Knight and the Grail. And so he's got to figure out what those things his dad has been researching all his life, what they actually mean. So things like the penitent man, and he's got to duck down and not get his head chopped off. And then when he's got to walk across to get to the other side and have faith. And really, it's just that you can't see the path. And then once he walks out, it's like, oh, it's obvious that that's there.
Can I tell you why that scene in particular has a profound resonance for me? As a child, I played the video game version of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for the Sega Mega Drive before I saw the film.
So you didn't know?
So getting through those obstacles at the very end of the game was like the most. I was pulling out my hair. I was shouting at the screen. I was close to like throwing the controller across the room because like I had no idea what I was supposed to do. And so I had to basically memorize when the like blades would come to chop your head off or something. And it was only by repeated trial and error. And because it was a Mega Drive game, like one of those cartridge home console games, you couldn't save it. I'd have to play through like the whole game to get to that point, and then play through it again to figure out.
And if you'd had the movie, you would know well.
Well, and the last bit where he has to basically walk on thin air, take a leap of faith, and like I kept constantly jumping to my death until I figured out by accident that's what I had to do. I had to just like walk across. I was like, what the hell is going on? And it wasn't until like I saw the movie and I said, okay, so that's why I had to do it this way.
Makes sense now. But we were even having a debate over how those blades would still be sharp after all 2,000 years. And I was like, oh, maybe it was stainless steel. And then my husband was like, no, that wouldn't have been invented then. I'm like, maybe they're sharpened stones. But
isn't this like God's temple? Isn't like does like the Lord work in mysterious ways? Doesn't he make like this like non-degradable blades for this sort of thing?
I think with every movie that you watch, you do have to remember, I guess, you disconnect yourself a little bit from reality as well to accept some of the things you're seeing because it isn't real, but it is fun to watch. So, but I was even going like the scenes when they're under Venice and there are all the rats there. And I'm like, I don't think those rats would be there. There's nothing for them to eat. They go where they're where there's food. And my husband just kept going, Kylie, it's a movie. Relax. And me also questioning that Hitler should be much shorter than he is in the film.
I think because he's in the movie for less than a minute. Like he's in like there for 30 seconds. Maybe they thought they could get away with like casting someone who like doesn't look exactly like Hitler.
I have to admit, with watching Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail, it has led me down rabbit holes in that I'm really interested in Grail mythology, and so it sort of led me to read like the Da Vinci Code, and like there's a book called The Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which is all about that the Grail is not actually a physical thing, it's actually a person. And there's all these conspiracy theories, and I love a good conspiracy theory. And I have just been recently listening to a podcast where they've been saying that there's actually a cup in the UK which they believe is the Grail, and it's just like a little scent jar. And it's made of alabaster, and it has been dated to the 1st century kind of thing. Although then there was someone saying, well, there are other artifacts that would date from that time. Just because it happens to be the right kind of made of the right kind of substance and is the right age doesn't actually make it the whole. So I've read lots of interesting things just from watching Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Has taken me in lots of different directions.
I must confess that I still haven't got around to reading the Da Vinci Code yet. My knowledge of like Grail lore is pretty much limited to like, I don't know, John Borman's Excalibur movie and Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But yeah, I think, as I said, this comes back to what I was saying before. The appeal of the Indiana Jones movies to me is sort of like the blending of the real world historical elements with the sort of mythological, supernatural elements. And the way that I think it balances out like this sort of rough and tumble action adventure yarn with some very sort of tender-hearted, human drama, really. And I think that's probably the Spielberg touch.
Yes.
I mean, he didn't become the world's biggest film director for no reason. And I think it's that combination of spectacle and heart in his work that is the key to his like enduring appeal and popular success, I'd say.
I think he knows all the elements to make a good film and to tell a good story as well. So he understands like the combination of elements that will keep people captivated as well, in terms of he knows that the music's got to be good, and he knows that there needs to be some jokes in there, that there needs to be some of that family drama and connection. But there's also going to be some explosions and some bullets flying and things like that. And just that sense of adventure.
But the thing about Spielberg is that he is not only a technically proficient filmmaker in terms of the fact that, yes, there's these high-octane action sequences and the cinematography is elegant and the music is all artfully placed. He's also an actor's director. And you see that in the sort of, I don't know, there's this natural chemistry between the actors in this movie.
Yeah.
I mean, not just the sort of, sexual tension that exists sort of between Harrison Ford and Alison Doody as Indiana Jones and Elsa Schneider, but also like the father-son relationship between Sean Connery and Harrison Ford as the two Joneses.
And it even really well together. And even like that scene where they're going, Dad, Junior, like that, yeah, they're funny, but also you see the connection between them through the whole film. And there's times where there's quite touching scenes, as well as some of the times when they're cranky at each other and telling each other off like fathers and sons do.
Well, yeah, and you see that, I don't know, in Harrison Ford and Sean Connery, who are both like these larger-than-life movie stars, they're not the kind of actors who can just sort of, they're not chameleons who can sort of vanish within a character. There's always a trace of Harrison Ford or a trace of Sean Connery in sort of every character that they play. I mean, especially Sean Connery, who just never lets go of that Scottish accent in anything to spouse. I mean, Claire and I were talking about Highlander in the previous episode and how like he was cast as a Spaniard. And
It did not work. It wasn't convincing anyone.
I still loved him in the role because he had sort of charm and the sort of, I don't know, he sold me as like the sage mentor character. But in this also, like, despite the sort of different accents and the fact that I think Sean Connery is only 12 years older than Harrison Ford in real life, but still, like, they have this rapport with each other, and they're both like willing to, I don't know, allow themselves to be vulnerable on screen.
And they're not really out acting each other either. They're not competing in any way. They're working in harmony a bit.
Sure.
I did have some questions though, because they both drink from the cup. But in later movies, Henry has passed and Indiana has grown quite old. I'm like,
there's a line that the knight says at the end of the movie, which is often missed by people because it's just a fleeting, like, throwaway line. But he says basically the power of the Grail can't endure beyond the Great Seal, but basically beyond the door to the temple. So the reason.
So do you think even if they've drunk from the cup, it's not going to work outside? I wondered if he just meant you couldn't take the Grail outside of. But that's interesting to think of it like that.
Well, I thought that was the reason why the knight had stayed like cooped up in this temple for so long, is because otherwise he'd die, and he had to stay there to be the custodian of the Grail until the next person came along.
Yes.
With the original trilogy, yes, I've noticed that there are certain sequences where like some of the special effects haven't aged that well. I'm just thinking where
we did notice a bit of blue screen last night.
Just don't look close.
But even if you go back to Raiders of the Lost Ark at the end where everybody is shrinking and burning or whatever happens to them, and even with the bad guy in The Last Crusade when he takes a drink from the wrong cup and he ages and dies, I'm like, whoa, okay, that would be very different if that was made now, because of all the CGI and things that are available to us now. Whereas, so some of that old school stuff does look a bit not as quality as it could be these days, I guess. But some of that is part of the fun, I think, as well, that it looks a little bit interesting.
And I don't know, I just roll with all of that. Walter Donovan was the villain in The Last Crusade. He was played by Julian Glover, who has a sort of suave, dapper, gentlemanly demeanor to him. And at the start of the movie, you're not sure. Like, he seems like, quite a stand-up guy, sort of a surprise reveal that he is the villain. And he was previously in a James Bond movie, For Your Eyes Only, where he played a similarly duplicitous, suave character that you initially think he's an ally of Bond, but then he turns out to be the main villain of the piece. I like the fact that he's not a showy villain. Like, he's not one of those ones who tends to posture and monologue. He just sort of, gets on with things. And
there is one character we haven't mentioned, Salah, that is in quite a few of the movies. He contributes quite well, John Rhys-Davies. I'm always surprised when I see him in things as an older man now. He's from Indiana Jones, and he pops his head up every now and then in some different show. But he's kind of like a stalwart of the franchise, I guess, as well in some ways. He's always there to help Indy out when he needs it.
And it's interesting, again, I saw this before Raiders of the Lost Ark. So I sort of saw him introduced as Indy, a longtime friend, before I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark and saw them initially introduced. But yeah, John Rhys-Davies is one of those solid workhorse actors. character actors, you just, know that he shows up. He's always going to, give it his best shot.
Because he was in like Sliders, he's been in Lord of the Rings, he's kind of sort of, it's like, oh, there he is. But yeah, I'm quite fond of his character. Although in Raiders, as we started watching it, there's a scene where all of his children run in to surround Indy to get him out of a little bit of a jam. I'm like, I don't know. Is that quite ethical? Potentially all your children could have been killed right then. But instead they surround him and get him out of the place that he's in, and so he's not getting shot by a Nazi, of course.
Well, yeah, the casual treatment of sort of like child endangerment is like one of those things I wonder about this movie. Would they get away with it these days? The other things I perhaps wonder about is sort of like the sexual tension between, Elsa and Indy. How like they slap each other a bit, and there's a bit of fear, sort of forcible kissing, and like it just sort of spills over into wild hot sex, and it's like, this isn't very politically correct. I mean, but it's sort of kind of true to sort of like the screwball like vibe of a lot of like the 1930s movies that it's trying to emulate. So in an odd way, I'd say like, yes, this isn't politically correct, but that's kind of the point.
But it does resonate, like in all the films, there is that, like even with Temple of Doom, with Kate Capshaw, there's that similar sexual tension and being angry at each other one minute and then being passionate the next, and that love-hate kind of thing happening a lot, which is just, some of it is just to drive the plot as well. But, sometimes it is a bit like, oh, should he be yelling at her right now? Would that be acceptable today? But there are times when in tension you do yell at someone else. But, it is, some of that is a little, I did have a few eyebrow raises watching it last night where I was like, oh, he's sort of got his hand around her neck, and so those sort of things were a bit like, oh, that's a bit cavalier. Maybe that isn't quite PC these days.
Well, I think that's the thing. The character of Indiana Jones is an anti-hero. He's not a hero. And many of the things he does are ethically questionable. I mean, a lot of what he does is basically grave robbing rather than like archaeology per se. And that's the thing. It's one of the reasons why I tend to be a bit leery of people who try to apply present day values to stories that are set in the past, because I think if you want to capture a sort of historical flavor, even in the context of like a very fanciful adventure yarn like Indiana Jones, you have to acknowledge the character flaws, the sort of toxic attitudes that existed in that culture at that time. Is there anything you wanted to say that you haven't got up? Because you said you took notes and everything. So if you want to go through your notes.
I don't think so. Like in terms of, I had thought I had a lot to say, but I think that some of it will not be interested to a person who's just interested in the movie. So I really have just raised like my interest in archaeology and the Holy Blood, Holy Grail book, and the connections to Dan Brown. Like it sort of is like that initial idea of searching for the Grail has like rippled through society, and then if you get into the Arthurian legends, like you've talked about Excalibur, and so I don't think that I have too much to add, other than I just love the movie and it's exciting to have rewatched it and enjoy it. Like I really did enjoy it again. Although now I'm like, I need to get on Etsy and see if I can get a t-shirt.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with your friends. If you have any questions or would like to provide suggestions for future episodes, you can send an email to fantasypodcastfeedback@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.